November 14, 1944. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly under a sky so vast it seemed impossible. For 23 German women stepping off a military transport truck near the small town of Florence, the landscape was as alien as the moon itself. They had expected many things about American captivity, but nothing had prepared them for this. Back in Germany, they had served the Reich in occupied France, working as clerks, radio operators, and nurses for the Wehrmacht. Now they stood in a land of saguaro cacti and endless sand, squinting against a sun that felt different from any they had known in Europe. The heat was dry and unforgiving, even in November, so unlike the damp cold of the camps they had heard about back home. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of the few female officers assigned to oversee the new facility, watched as the German women climbed down from the truck. Their gray auxiliary uniforms were dusty from the long journey, and their faces showed a mixture of defiance, fear, and exhaustion. Among them was 24-year-old Greta Steinmann from Munich, who clutched a small photograph of her family against her chest. Beside her stood 19-year-old Elsa Hoffmann, the youngest of the group, whose wide eyes took in the strange new world with barely concealed wonder. The camp itself was modest, a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing, but what made it unusual was its location on the edge of a working cattle ranch. The prisoners would soon learn that their captors included not just military personnel, but local Arizona cowboys who had been hired to help guard the facility and teach the women agricultural work. These men, with their wide-brimmed hats and weathered faces, were as foreign to the German women as the landscape itself. On that first evening, as the women sat in confused silence in their assigned barracks, something unexpected happened. 3 cowboys approached the fence, carrying wooden crates. The tallest among them was 28-year-old Jack Morrison, a third-generation rancher whose family had worked this land since before Arizona became a state. Beside him stood Miguel Torres, a Mexican-American cowboy whose family had been in the territory even longer, and young Billy Patterson, barely 21, who had been rejected from military service due to a childhood injury, but wanted to serve his country somehow. What they carried in those crates would become the symbol of everything that would happen at this small desert camp over the coming months. Lieutenant Chen watched with curiosity as Jack Morrison approached the fence and called out in his slow Western drawl. The German women, understanding no English, looked at each other uncertainly. Then Jack did something that would be remembered for decades to come. He reached into the crate and pulled out a glass bottle of Coca-Cola, its distinctive shape unmistakable even in the fading desert light. He held it up, smiled, and gestured for the women to come closer. In that moment, with a simple bottle of soda, the first crack appeared in the wall between enemies. Greta Steinmann was the first to approach the fence. Something about the cowboy's genuine smile disarmed her natural suspicion. She had been taught that Americans were cruel, that they would treat prisoners with contempt and violence. Yet here was this tall man in dusty boots and a worn hat, offering her something with the kind of casual friendliness she might have received from a neighbor back home. She reached through the wire fence hesitantly, her fingers brushing against the cold glass of the Coca-Cola bottle. Jack Morrison's calloused hand guided it gently into her grasp, and he pantomimed drinking, then pointed to the metal bottle opener attached to a post nearby. The sound of the cap popping off echoed in the quiet evening air. Greta lifted the bottle to her lips, tasted the sweet, fizzy liquid, and her eyes widened in surprise. She had heard of Coca-Cola, of course. It was American, and therefore something she had been told represented everything wrong with Western decadence and excess. But the taste was nothing like she expected. It was refreshing, sweet, and somehow comforting after the long, dusty journey. She looked back at her fellow prisoners, many of whom were now standing, drawn by curiosity to see what was happening. Elsa Hoffmann came next, her youthful excitement barely contained despite months of military discipline. When she tasted the Coca-Cola, she couldn't help but smile, a genuine expression of pleasure that seemed to surprise her as much as it did the watching cowboys. One by one, the other women approached the fence. Some took the bottles eagerly, others with visible reluctance, as if accepting this small kindness might somehow betray their homeland. But thirst and curiosity won out, and soon nearly all 23 women stood along the fence, sipping Coca-Cola, while the three cowboys watched with satisfaction. Miguel Torres, whose Spanish inflected English the women couldn't understand anyway, simply nodded encouragingly at each woman who accepted a bottle. Billy Patterson, shy and uncertain, managed to make a young prisoner named Anna Vogel laugh when he accidentally dropped a bottle and had to chase it as it rolled across the dusty ground. The sound of her laughter, spontaneous and unguarded, seemed to startle everyone, including Anna herself. It was perhaps the first time any of them had laughed since their capture months earlier. Lieutenant Chen observed the scene with mixed feelings. She knew that fraternization with prisoners was technically discouraged, but she also recognized something important happening in this simple exchange. These cowboys, with their straightforward Western hospitality, were doing something that no amount of military protocol could achieve. They were reminding the German women that they were still human beings, not just enemy prisoners. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible in their intensity, the women returned to their barracks carrying empty Coca-Cola bottles. Several of them, including Greta, kept their bottles, placing them carefully on small shelves beside their bunks. They would become treasured possessions, symbols of the moment when everything they thought they knew about Americans began to change. Winter in the Arizona desert was nothing like winter in Germany. Instead of snow and freezing temperatures, the days remained warm while the nights grew surprisingly cold. The German women learned to adjust to this strange climate, wrapping themselves in the wool blankets provided by the camp during the chilly desert evenings, then shedding layers as the morning sun turned their barracks into ovens by midday. It was during these early weeks that the real transformation began, not through any grand gestures, but through the simple routine of daily work and unexpected companionship. The cowboys had been assigned to teach the women basic ranch skills. The reasoning was practical. The camp needed to be as self-sufficient as possible, and the surrounding ranch land offered opportunities for the prisoners to contribute productive labor. But what started as mere work assignment evolved into something far more meaningful. Jack Morrison took particular interest in teaching the women how to care for the horses. He noticed that Greta Steinman had a natural way with animals, her gentle voice and patient movements earning the trust of even the most skittish mares. Through gestures and simple demonstrations, Jack showed her how to brush the horses, clean their hooves, and check them for injuries. Elsa Hoffman found herself working alongside Miguel Torres in the vegetable gardens that had been planted to supplement the camp's food supplies. Miguel's patient teaching style transcended the language barrier. He would demonstrate how to plant seeds at the proper depth, how to identify weeds from seedlings, and how to water efficiently in the desert climate. Elsa discovered she loved working in the soil, feeling the warm earth between her fingers, watching tiny green shoots emerge from the ground. It reminded her of helping her grandmother in their small garden back in Bavaria, a memory that brought both comfort and sadness. The Coca-Cola deliveries became a weekly ritual. Every Saturday evening, Jack, Miguel, and Billy would arrive at the fence with their crates of cold bottles retrieved from the ice house in town. The women began to anticipate these moments, gathering at the fence not just for the refreshing drinks, but for the brief connection with the outside world that the cowboys represented. Billy Patterson had started bringing his harmonica, playing simple melodies while the women sipped their Coca-Colas and watched the desert sunset. The music needed no translation, speaking directly to the homesickness that all of them carried. Anna Vogel, who had laughed at Billy's clumsiness on that first night, began to look forward to seeing him each week. Though they shared no common language, they had developed their own form of communication through smiles, gestures, and the universal language of kindness. Billy would save the coldest Coca-Cola for her, presenting it with an exaggerated formal bow that always made her smile. These small moments of joy became lifelines for women who were thousands of miles from home, surrounded by uncertainty about what the future held. December brought the first real cold to the Arizona desert, and with it came the approach of Christmas. Lieutenant Chen faced a dilemma similar to the one Captain Sullivan had encountered at Fort Deans. How should they handle the holiday for prisoners who were so far from home? She decided to allow the women to create simple decorations from materials available in the camp, hoping it might ease their obvious homesickness. What she didn't anticipate was how the Cowboys would respond to this gesture. Jack Morrison appeared at the camp on December 20th, with his pickup truck loaded with cut pine branches from the mountains north of Phoenix. The scent of evergreen was so powerfully reminiscent of German forests that several women openly wept when they caught the fragrance on the desert air. Jack, embarrassed by the emotional response, simply tipped his hat and helped unload the branches at the fence line. Miguel Torres arrived the next day with his wife Rosa, who brought traditional Mexican wedding cookies and tamales to share. Though the food was unfamiliar to the German women, the gesture of Rosa's kindness transcended cultural boundaries. The language barrier had been slowly eroding over the weeks. Greta had been studying English phrases from an old school book that Lieutenant Chen had provided, and she was becoming an informal translator for the group. On Christmas Eve, she approached Jack at the fence with carefully rehearsed words. "Mr. Jack, we want to thank you. For the trees, for the Coca-Cola, for treating us like people." Her accent was thick, her grammar imperfect, but the sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. Jack shifted uncomfortably, unused to such direct expressions of gratitude. "Ma'am," he replied, "out here in the desert, we judge folks by how they act, not where they're from." That evening, the camp held a modest Christmas celebration. The German women sang traditional carols, their voices harmonizing in the clear desert night. "Stille Nacht" echoed across the compound, and Billy Patterson, listening from outside the fence, was surprised to recognize the melody. "That's Silent Night," he whispered to Miguel. "Same song, just in German." The realization seemed to strike him with unexpected force. These women sang the same Christmas hymns, celebrated the same holiday, longed for home the same way he did when he thought about his own family's Christmas gathering. The mail delivery on December 23rd had brought letters for some of the women, the first contact with their families in months. Greta received a brief letter from her mother, written in careful script on thin paper that had somehow survived the journey across the war-torn Atlantic. Her mother wrote about shortages, about fear, about hoping Greta was safe wherever she was. Reading those words, Greta understood that her family had no idea where she was being held or whether she would ever return. Elsa Hoffman received no letter at all, and her disappointment was visible to everyone around her. Spring arrived in the Arizona desert with wild flowers that transformed the brown landscape into unexpected patches of purple, yellow, and orange. But the beauty of the season was overshadowed by news that began filtering into the camp in late April of 1945. As Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, they were discovering concentration camps, and the reports coming back were almost too horrific to believe. Lieutenant Chen wrestled with whether to share this information with her German prisoners, ultimately deciding that they had a right to know what had been done in their country's name. She made American newspapers available in the common area, knowing that Greta and a few others could now read basic English. The first time Greta saw the photographs from Bergen-Belsen, she stood frozen in place, her hands gripping the edges of the newspaper until her knuckles turned white. The grainy black and white images showed skeletal figures, piles of bodies, evidence of systematic murder on a scale that seemed impossible. She read the descriptions with growing horror, her lips moving silently as she translated the words in her mind. Dachau, Buchenwald, names of places she had never heard of, but which existed in the same Germany she had proudly served. Elsa found her there, tears streaming down Greta's face as she stared at the newspaper. "Was es los?" Elsa asked, and then she too saw the images. The sound she made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Other women gathered around, reading over each other's shoulders, trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. "This cannot be real," Anna Vogel whispered in German. "Our country would not do such things." But the evidence was there in stark black and white, undeniable and devastating. That afternoon, Jack Morrison arrived for his regular visit and found the camp unusually quiet. No women gathered at the fence. No sounds of conversation or activity came from the barracks. Lieutenant Chen met him at the gate, her expression grave. "They've seen the news from Germany," she explained. They're struggling with what it means. Jack removed his hat, running his fingers through his hair as he considered this. I reckon that's a heavy burden to carry, he said quietly. Finding out your country did something like that. He asked permission to enter the compound, something he had never done before. Lieutenant Chen hesitated, then nodded. Jack walked slowly to the barracks where the women had gathered, still clustered around those terrible newspapers. Greta looked up at him, her face ravaged by tears, and spoke in halting English. Mr. Jack, did our country really do these things? Jack knelt down so he was at eye level with her. Yes, ma'am, I believe it did. But that doesn't mean you did those things. You can't carry guilt for evil you never knew about and never supported. The weeks following the revelations from Germany were the darkest period in the camp's history. Several of the women refused to eat, consumed by guilt and shame for having served a regime capable of such atrocities. Greta wrote in a small notebook that Lieutenant Chen had given her, filling pages with questions that had no easy answers. How could we not have known? Were there signs we ignored? What does it mean to have worn the uniform of such evil? Her crisis of conscience was shared by nearly every woman in the compound, each struggling to reconcile the Germany they thought they knew with the one being revealed in daily news reports. Jack Morrison and the other Cowboys became unexpected counselors during this difficult time. They had fought against Japan, had friends who had died in Europe, yet they found themselves in the strange position of offering comfort to former enemies. Jack began bringing his elderly father, Thomas Morrison, to the camp. Thomas had served in the First World War and carried his own scars from that conflict. Through Greta's translation, he told the women something that stayed with them. War brings out the worst in nations and the best in individuals. You can't change what your country did, but you can choose who you become now that you know the truth. The presence of the German women prisoners had not gone unnoticed in Florence and the surrounding communities. Word had spread about the weekly Coca-Cola ritual, and reactions in town were sharply divided. At the local diner, heated debates erupted about whether Nazi prisoners deserved such kindness when American boys were still dying in the Pacific. A group of veterans organized a petition demanding the prisoners be moved to a more secure facility far from town. The local newspaper ran an editorial questioning the appropriateness of fraternization between guards and enemy prisoners, but unexpected defenders emerged. Rosa Torres, Miguel's wife, organized a group of ranch wives who had met some of the women during supervised visits to help with canning and preserving. These practical frontier women saw in the German prisoners something familiar. They were young women far from home, doing work with their hands, trying to make sense of a world that had been turned upside down. Those girls didn't build those camps, Rosa told the town council meeting. They're as horrified as we are. Maybe more so, because it was their own people who did it. Billy Patterson's mother, Margaret, became one of the most vocal supporters. She had seen how her son came home from the camp changed, talking about Anna with a respect and tenderness that reminded her of how people should treat each other. When someone at church suggested the prisoners should be denied basic comforts, Margaret stood up in the congregation and said, "Christ taught us to love our enemies. Seems to me that's exactly what my son and those cowboys are doing." May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived with the same brilliant sunshine that characterized every Arizona spring morning. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally over in Europe. In towns across America, celebrations erupted with parades, dancing in the streets, and church bells ringing for hours. But in the small prisoner of war camp outside Florence, the atmosphere was complicated by emotions that no simple celebration could contain. Lieutenant Chen gathered the 23 German women in the common area to announce what they all knew was coming. "The war in Europe is over," she told them in English, with Greta translating. "Arrangements are being made for your repatriation to Germany. You will be going home." The words should have brought relief, even joy. Instead, they were met with a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on everyone in the room. Going home. But what did that mean anymore? What home were they returning to? Letters from Germany had been arriving more regularly in recent weeks, and the news they contained was devastating. Elsa had finally heard from her family. Her father and brother were dead, killed in the final desperate defense of Berlin. Her mother was living in the rubble of what had once been their apartment building, surviving on rations provided by occupying Soviet forces. Anna Vogel learned that her entire hometown had been destroyed in Allied bombing raids. She had no idea if her family had survived or where they might be if they had. Greta's situation was perhaps the most complicated. Her mother's letters described a Germany that no longer existed, a country divided among conquering armies, its cities reduced to rubble, its people starving and desperate. "Come home quickly," her mother wrote. "We need you here." But Greta looked around at the Arizona desert, at the work she had been doing with the horses, at the community that had formed in this unlikely place, and wondered what she could possibly contribute to rebuilding a nation that had committed such horrors. That evening, Jack Morrison arrived with his usual delivery of Coca-Cola, but the mood was different from the weekly ritual that had sustained them through the winter. The women accepted the bottles quietly, without their usual smiles and conversation. Jack noticed immediately that something had changed. "They told you about repatriation," he said to Greta. It wasn't a question. She nodded, unable to speak for fear of crying. Jack was quiet for a long moment, watching the desert sun begin its descent toward the horizon. "What do you want to do?" he finally asked. The question hung in the air, like dust suspended in the evening light. What did she want? Greta realized that no one had asked her that question in years, perhaps ever. During the war, she had done what was expected, what was ordered, what was necessary. But now, for the first time, someone was asking what she actually wanted for her own life. The answer terrified her because it was so clear, so simple, and so impossible. She wanted to stay. The conversation that night between Greta and Jack Morrison continued long past the usual visiting hours. Lieutenant Chen, understanding the significance of what was being discussed, allowed it. Jack explained that he had been thinking about this possibility for weeks, ever since the news from Germany had started arriving. His ranch needed workers, good people who understood animals and weren't afraid of hard work. "I could sponsor you," he said carefully, "if that's what you wanted. Help you apply to stay legally, once you're no longer a prisoner." Greta returned to the barracks and shared this conversation with the other women. The discussion that followed lasted until the early hours of morning. 11 of the 23 women found themselves drawn to the possibility of remaining in America, at least temporarily. The reasons varied. Some, like Elsa, had nothing and no one to return to. Others, like Anna, feared the chaos and starvation that awaited them in occupied Germany. But for all of them, there was something else. They had found in this Arizona desert camp something unexpected. Not just safety, but purpose and the possibility of redemption. When they approached Lieutenant Chen with their request 3 days later, she was not entirely surprised. What did surprise her was the immediacy and enthusiasm with which the local community responded. Jack Morrison's offer to sponsor Greta was just the beginning. Miguel and Rosa Torres offered to take in Elsa, who had proven herself invaluable in the gardens. Billy Patterson's family stepped forward to sponsor Anna, despite some resistance from neighbors who questioned the wisdom of bringing a former enemy into their home. The legal complications were substantial. These women were still technically prisoners of war, subject to Geneva Convention protocols that mandated repatriation. But the War Department, learning from the precedent set at Fort Deans in Massachusetts, had developed procedures for handling such unusual requests. The women could be reclassified as displaced persons, eligible to apply for immigration status if they could secure sponsors and demonstrate their commitment to American values. The announcement of their decision divided the remaining women in ways that were painful to witness. Friendships that had sustained them through months of captivity were strained by different choices about the future. 12 women decided they must return to Germany, no matter how difficult the situation there. Their families needed them, their country needed rebuilding, and they felt a moral obligation to face the consequences of what Germany had become. One of them, a 30-year-old former nurse named Christina Weber, spoke for this group. We cannot run from what our country did. We must go back and help make it better. The division was not made in anger, but in sorrow. Both groups understood that they were each choosing difficult paths for different but equally valid reasons. On the final Sunday before the repatriation process would begin, all 23 women gathered one last time. They sang together, German hymns and American songs they had learned, their voices carrying across the desert as the sun set in brilliant shades of red and gold. The transition from prisoner to immigrant was not immediate or simple. The 11 women who chose to stay spent the summer of 1945 in a strange limbo, no longer prisoners but not yet free. They lived in temporary housing provided by their sponsors, while paperwork wound its way through military and immigration bureaucracies. During this time, they learned what it truly meant to build a life from nothing in a foreign land. Greta moved to the Morrison Ranch in June, living in a small cottage that had once housed the ranch foreman. Jack treated her with the same straightforward respect he showed all his workers, teaching her the full scope of ranch operations. She proved to have an instinct for training horses, a skill that would eventually become her livelihood. But the integration wasn't without challenges. Some neighboring ranchers refused to do business with Jack once they learned he had hired a former German soldier. Anonymous letters arrived calling him a traitor for harboring the enemy. Elsa Hoffman flourished under Rosa Torres's patient guidance. Rosa treated the young German woman like the daughter she had never had, teaching her not just about desert gardening, but about Mexican-American culture, cooking, and the complex history of the borderlands. Elsa's facility with languages meant she quickly became fluent in both English and Spanish, eventually finding work as a translator for the County Agricultural Extension Office. Her ability to bridge 3 languages and cultures made her invaluable to the diverse farming community. Anna Vogel's integration into the Patterson family proved the most challenging and the most rewarding. Billy's obvious affection for Anna was not initially shared by all family members. His uncle, who had lost a son at Normandy, refused to attend family gatherings if that German girl was present. But Anna's quiet determination to prove herself worthy of their acceptance gradually won over even the most skeptical relatives. She took a job at the local general store, where her careful attention to detail and genuine warmth with customers slowly changed minds about what a former enemy could become. The women who had returned to Germany wrote letters describing the almost incomprehensible devastation they found. Christina Weber's descriptions of Berlin were particularly harrowing: cities reduced to rubble, people living in cellars, widespread hunger and disease. Yet her letters also contained notes of hope, describing how Germans were beginning the long process of rebuilding and reckoning with their past. She wrote to Greta, "You made the right choice to stay. What we are building here will take generations. But know that we carry your spirit with us, the lessons we learned together about forgiveness and new beginnings." The exchange of letters became a bridge between 2 worlds. Those in Arizona sent packages when they could afford to, care packages containing coffee, chocolate, and powdered milk. Those in Germany sent news of reconstruction efforts, of denazification programs, and slowly, of a country beginning to face its crimes and transform itself. The women who had once been prisoners together remained connected by bonds that transcended the ocean between them, united by the shared experience of having chosen their own destinies in the aftermath of the war. 27 years after that first Coca-Cola was offered through a fence in the Arizona desert, Greta Steinman Morrison stood in the main square of Florence, Arizona, watching the dedication of an unusual monument. It was 1972, and the small town had decided to commemorate a piece of its history that had once been controversial but had become a source of quiet pride. The monument was simple: a bronze sculpture of a cowboy's hand passing a Coca-Cola bottle through a fence to an outstretched woman's hand. The symbolism was clear to everyone who knew the story. Greta had married Jack Morrison in 1948 after years of working side by side on the ranch. They had built one of the most successful horse training operations in the state, known for their gentle methods and Greta's almost intuitive understanding of equine behavior. Their 3 children, raised speaking both English and German, represented the bridge between 2 cultures that had once been sworn enemies. Standing beside Greta at the monument dedication was Elsa Torres, who had become a beloved figure in the county's agricultural community. She had written a bilingual guide to dessert farming that was used throughout the Southwest, combining traditional German growing techniques with Mexican and American innovations.